Welcome to Madame Raven's. This way to the library. She's been expecting you.
Nightmare by BearLair64. Memory can be untrustworthy. Details fade over time, and we replace them with better outcomes produced by better people than we actually were. A natural way to reject failure of character and actions that we would excise from ourselves and from time. I finally had to give in to the fever. It had been raging since yesterday morning. I'd called for a doctor's appointment, but she wouldn't be available for a few days. When it topped 104 degrees Fahrenheit, I decided to just barge in and hope that, with a fever that high, they'd work me in, especially because of the likelihood of contagion. I didn't know what the problem was. I had no trouble breathing, but I was very weak, so I suspected some sort of flu. When I arrived, the very polite young lady at the reception station informed me, very politely of course, that the doctor was simply unavailable. Fortunately, one of the nurses stopped at the station and took one look at my flushed features and glassy eyes. "Sir, which doctor are you waiting to see?" "Dr. Gibson," I told her. Was that my voice? Sounded mushy, like some kind of drunk. My thoughts trailed off into a quiet place as mushy as my speech had become. I fell back into one of the waiting room chairs and slumped. I just couldn't stay on my feet any longer. A bright light pierced my eyes, and I heard voices that sounded muffled and far away, felt hands grasping at me. Then a rushing sensation. The train was leaving the station at high velocity and headed for the bright headlights of an oncoming locomotive on the same track. Everything was dark, but I could tell it was spinning. Chaotic, dark place. A sensory deprivation chamber attached to a merry-go-round carnival ride. There were no more sounds, no visions, no real smells or tastes, and no physical sensations. Simply the perception of dizziness. The first to return was nausea. Definitely a full-on amusement park ride. Too powerful for a parking lot carnival machine. The stink of medical sterility and the rise and burn of bile in my esophagus and throat. The sour stench in my nostrils. The roar of voices once again in the distance, but approaching rapidly. Then the glaring white lights blasting into my eyes. I tried to raise my hand to protect my vision from the punishing rays, but it would not obey my commands. The light left, and all that remained of it was dancing spots, constantly changing colors and shapes. A plain white field stretched above me. It eventually resolved into the panels of white drop ceiling. I attempted to turn my head to search for the source of the voices, but my ridiculous neck would not obey my orders any more than had my rebellious hands. I did a toe-to-head evaluation. All controls were dead. The machine was turned on, but the processors refused to engage. I couldn't feel. The smells and taste were irrelevant. I could see, but only in a limited fashion. But I could hear. Barged into the doctor's office. Obviously fever, delirium. We have to get the fever under control. Seen anything like it? Best put a quarantine in effect. See if he has any family or other contacts who may be infected. You say it was Dr. Gibson's office? I'm sure they have an emergency contact. I could finally hear and understand now. The voices faded again. It felt as though they distanced themselves. Some sensation returned. A pain in my arm. Pressure from fluids being forced into me. An IV drip. Yes, made sense. Still, no voluntary movement, but definitely pain inside the skull, behind the eyes and between the ears. whole thing was splitting into quarters. So intense. All I could hear and feel was the pounding of hooves, and I felt the pressure of some being squatting on my chest, constricting my breathing and heartbeat. I tried and failed to embrace the void, the emptiness, the loss of memory, the cessation of pain. No void, but rather many sensations, encroaching all at once. The darkness, not of blindness, but simply of night. The sounds of cars and people talking, and of horrendous singing from below and in front of where I stood. The smells of dirty, stagnant water, urine, fresh-baked pizza, and too much cologne on the group of young males who passed. The taste of bile, and the feel of rough stone under my hands and hard concrete under my feet. It all impinged on my senses with a painful, crushing weight. That's when the singing once more grated across my eardrums. Don't worry. Be happy. Don't worry, be. Disjointedly rang out from some lost soul on the walkway beneath where I perched. I stood on the street-level sidewalk, and down below, beside the old canal, a street person warbled away the musical piece without a tune in his drunken, slurred voice. The stench of his long, unwashed body rose, and I had to choke back the retch that would have sent a torrent of alcohol-soaked vomit spilling over the wall and into the would-be crooner, to add to his ripe effluvium. Then I realized where I was, followed immediately by the understanding of when. Georgetown, Washington, D.C., 1988. The memories of this very night flooded back into my consciousness. I'd been out on the prowl as any young man in that place at that time. It was a circus of people and music. Yes, I could hear real music now, blended with the audio atrocity from below. I'd left my favorite den of iniquity because of the headache. I'd come out for fresh air and to regain my focus. Instead, my senses had been assaulted by the human detritus below. I felt that the rock in the wall under my left hand was loose. The cement that bound it to its brethren had eroded over time. It was a reasonably large rock, quite heavy by the feel of it. The singing ended abruptly with a wet crunch and the grunting, rattling exhale of a person's last breath. I felt another freight train rush, the oncoming headlights, and then it was gone. And once more the bland ceiling panels rested above me, empty, silent, and still. The pains were all still present. I had to sit up. I had to tell anyone in the room that would listen that the events I just experienced had not happened. At least, not as I just re-envisioned them. Yet I could not. The awful sensation had returned, but not the control. I could feel everything that happened to my otherwise lifeless body, but I was trapped. The intensity of the headache had been reduced once I'd smashed that poor man's head in the dream. Yet I didn't remember doing that. I recall that I yelled at him that he was more drunk than I was, but I'd soon have to beat him. I did, too. I remember going back into the club with a stream of drunken curses following me from the side of the old sluggish canal, just down from the Exorcist stairs, from the old movie with the tumbling priest. I ended up plastered, and my buddies dragged me back to my room and dumped me. That was it. The headache got better the next day, hadn't it? I recalled wanting to smash the old gimp's head, but I'd never do anything like that. Would I? The lesser pains of the IV needle and the choking sensation in my throat. The The strong sensation of urinating every liquid I'd ever consumed. Catheter. Oh, how? But the intensity of the headache had ebbed. I was in constant misery, unable to move or function voluntarily. Yet I could feel and taste and smell the unpleasant methodologies employed by our finest medical techniques. Someone wanted desperately to keep me alive. About the time I thought that my mind would snap from the flood of unpleasant sensations and the inability to move or speak, the pain in my brain and the weight on my chest once again increased. Slowly this time, it built to a crescendo rather than crashing into me all at once. The hooves pounding on body and mind eventually had drowned out the other miseries and took complete hold of my conscious mind. Cold, dry air penetrated my clothing, all the layers that should have kept me warm. We were in the desert after all. This time I knew instantly where and when I was. The Mojave Desert of California. Army Reserve Training, January 1991. Craptastic. I was in a makeshift firing position on top of a sandstone ridge. Why not? Everything else was made of sand around me. Instead of a nice deep hole with the proper cover and camouflage, our best efforts in the waning light of day had led to a funneling indentation in the rock, just over 2 feet at the deepest point. I'd argue that it was too close to the very steep edge, but our LT had decided to take a personal hand to make sure that I'd followed his glorious plan of war. We had to be able to see below us, he insisted. At the foot of the cliff lay a roadway. We'd somehow have to point our weapons downward over the cliff and fire into the defile below should the OP-4, the opposing forces, attack. He envisioned some castle parapet. What I'd offered was a miserable, shallow pit. Once his rant about my incompetence was complete, and he demanded answers, I did my best. I offered a reasonable solution. Sir, perhaps I could dig out a shallow trench, wide enough to fit 2 soldiers in the prone position, and keep us low enough for protection. Stretch it out away from the edge. It would be more stable. That was for him. He was in no mood for rational solutions. A PFC, for whom he'd taken a particular dislike, had now defied him. This shit again. Are you a moron or just lazy? Maybe weak? As he said the last, he stomped over to the front of the firing position and perched on the edge of the precipitous plunge. He bent forward and down since I was currently standing in the pit and was 2 feet shorter than him. He rapped his knuckles against my helmet, and I felt a piercing pain, an overwhelming sensation that caused me to vomit onto his boots. He stood quickly and by instinct took a step backward, cartwheeling above the void. I leaned forward and assisted his plummet onto the rocks and hard-packed dirt below. Then I lodged my backside against the solid wall and used my feet to push the unstable front wall. Now it looked like an accident. I snapped back to the bland, now somewhat blurred field of leprous white on the ceiling above, and the splitting nightmare headache once again faded into the background, and the weight on my chest lightened just a hair. Yet the other miseries remained. I hadn't pushed the lieutenant off the cliff. He had been a tremendous dick, but when he started to fall, I'd lunged forward and grabbed his vomit-slick boots. The edge of the cliff had crumbled some, but I'd managed to dig in and yell for help. I ended up with a minor medal for saving the arstard's life. Hadn't I? I remembered the ceremony. My buddies laughing about it afterwards, giving me a hard time because I'd served a nightmare boss and managed to stink up a perfectly good uniform. What was that stink? I realized that it was me. The nurse was in the process of changing my diaper. Diaper? How long had I been in this condition? Too long, I decided, yet I could do nothing to defend myself as I caught a glimpse of the woman and the moue of distaste she wore for her current task. I couldn't blame her, yet neither could I stop her nor help myself. It was like being a very young infant, only I was unable to cry out my frustration, pain, and mortification. The hellish condition persisted until I was once more on the verge of madness. All my physical sensations were flooded with unpleasant sensations. It was like being swarmed by gnats and mosquitoes. No overwhelming agony, just constant nagging discomfort and the inability to fully lose consciousness, to sleep, to achieve a healing rest, something I needed desperately. Then the waves of pain once more struck the interior of my skull. The hooves pounded and my heart and lungs felt crushed. Diane looked so fine in those Guess jeans and her tight little sweater. I definitely understood why any dude on the planet would want to be with her. Yet she was mine, at least in '99, and I loved to rhyme 'cause it sounded so fine. Yeah, maybe not. She'd remained with me through some rough times. I thought she'd always would. I'd made plenty of money after that mess in the Gulf. Didn't hurt to save the life of someone with money to spare. I hadn't even wanted to be part of the guard detail for that contractor. I was so glad that I was through, and now I had a nice place. A high-rise condo that faced the Atlantic in South Florida. I'd spent plenty on it. And on Diane. I'd been generous and loving, but she betrayed me. All of them eventually did. What they really loved was the money, the trappings, the various toys, in her case, fast cars, diamonds, and young men with taut muscles. However, I couldn't just push her over the rail. Too obvious. She hadn't exactly been discreet, so enough of our friends were aware, long before I was, that she was a serial cheater. Some friends, I thought in the desolation my mind had become, a mind now split by an oncoming headache and shortness of breath. She was plenty frisky with me, though, as we lounged on the patio. Just another moment of frivolous sexual release for her. She'd slithered into my lap like the serpent she was, and we both enjoyed our favorite drinks as we cuddled and gazed into the night. The wave cap shone white, and the thread of gold that was the beach shone in the moonlight. It had been vacuumed that day. Yep, they actually vacuumed the beach for we palmies. I felt Diane start to get excited. Not just sexually, but she was full of nervous energy. She squirmed and spoke rapidly and squeezed her arms around my neck, just a little too tightly. Oh, hey, Dee Dee, where'd those pupils go? I almost asked playfully. Maybe they'd gone down the dirty rabbit hole between your thighs, you cheating skank. I put on the crocodile tears when I made the report after I'd found her body on the patio. The residue of some cocaine on the little round glass tabletop. Oh no, detective, I don't use that stuff. As soon as they discovered after my urinalysis, I didn't know that my dear sweet Diane did either. It must have led her to that awful man. Led her to choked sobs and feigned grief, at least on my part. The police had bought it, but her family, especially her sister, never did. Oh, how that woman cursed me. The headache was gone, The weight lifted. I was free. Yet I hadn't fed Dee Dee any tainted cocaine. We had a fight, and sure, I'd thrown her out. Out, not off. What was happening with my memories? With my body now. I shook and shuddered, and my bones crashed together at the joints. The tube in my mouth and throat scraped, and the horse of the IV pulled loose from the needle. A nice stream of blood flowed from it. I caught a glimpse of the crimson stream and of the person in brightly colored scrubs. The seizure eventually subsided. The jerky, flopping movements calmed, yet the low-level pain remained, with the addition of soreness in joints and muscles. I'd descended to a lower circle of perdition. It didn't take nearly as long to reach the borderlands of insanity. Chicago. How I hated that city, except for the food and the wind from the lake that occasionally stifled the stench. It had few redeeming qualities, at least in 2008. The murder rate was soaring towards the 500-plus mark, and that it would eventually reach. Not that anyone would notice, it just seemed perfectly normal at the time. The way the place worked. I'd had a long day at the convention, and I was pretty drunk. I decided to go out on the town and find some famous Chi-Town pizza. Being drunk made me hungry. I had the air cranked in my rented Lexus, fancy Toyota, and my tunes cranked along with it. Despite my inebriation, I obeyed the traffic signal when the light turned red. I immediately wished that I hadn't, as two youngish-looking men charged my car. One stood in front of it, and the other menacing me with a pistol on the driver's side. Didn't they know guns were illegal in the city? I was too stupidly drunk to be afraid. I floored it. The hood rat in front briefly became a hood ornament, then quickly tumbled off one side as I increased speed. I may have heard gunfire from the other, but it wasn't clear over the noise of the stereo and the rapid, ever-increasing distance from the source of the noise. I watched him in the rearview mirror and flipped him off, and made a taunting noise that only I could hear, and BAM! There was a heavy impact from the front of the car. Somehow the airbag didn't deploy. I rolled over whatever it was. Had the consistency of a speed bump made of wet concrete. That's what a 14-year-old body felt like when a Lexus rolled over it. At least from the perspective of the driver. I kept rolling and assured myself that it must have been a dog or just some trash lying in the street. I slowed to make the next corner and looked just to see. Sprawling in the street was a girl, her legs splayed and rolled outward from the shattered hip joints that should have allowed her femur to rest at that unnatural angle. She twitched and her head lolled back, and I took off again at the end of the block. I paused and panted, then found the nearest I-train station. I parked the car and dropped the keys on the pavement beside it. After a solid meal at the hotel and a few hours of rest to allow the booze to metabolize, I reasoned out of my story and reported that the car was stolen from where I'd parked it on the street to avoid the parking fees at the expensive hotel. It was a weak story, but eventually the car thieves were located, and among the many other charges they faced was murder for running over a female subject of 14 years. There was plenty of evidence on the grille and front bumper, and traces of her DNA on the tires. I was back home and laughing hard when I saw their hapless expressions in their booking photos on the news. Served them right for stealing my ride. I'd cackled with glee. Once more, I'd gotten away with murder. The headache ended abruptly this time, and the weight vanished. I knew I hadn't run over any kid. Those guys had carjacked me. I'd ridden back on the L train, but only after I'd filed a pointless police report. The event had scared some of the inebriation from me, so I'd bought a bottle of cheap booze from a liquor store around the corner. I poured all but a little into a storm drain. I'd figured that when the cops arrived, I could tell them I'd started drinking after the carjacking. It was a good plan, but unnecessary. It took them almost an hour to arrive, and they did nothing helpful. Didn't even ask if I'd been injured. There'd been witnesses, but none of them admitted that they saw anything. I hadn't been fond of the city up until that point, yet I learned to deeply hate it after my experience. All the previous maladies and aches combined once more, and I felt a new discomfort at several points along the posterior of my increasingly light and skeletal frame. Bed sores. The stench had increased, and my room remained gloomy almost all of the time. I lay there rotting in all meaningful ways, a barely breathing corpse with a pulse. Maladies reigned supreme and trounced all over me in a parade of wretchedness. My forebrain once more burned, both physically and in lunacy. I must have been broken for at least a short time before the splintering pain once more poured into my head, and my chest felt dished in from the trampling hooves. Trees all around, cold, weak light with a gray quality, very still, somewhat damp air. At the hunting trip, I'd gone with some business associates in Missouri. I'd never hunted previously, but those hillbilly types would expect me to go out into the freezing woods with them in the hopes of bagging some poor whitetail so that we could all pretend that it meant something, some ritual bond. Here in 2014, you'd think people would have learned better. But I was about to take these yokels for quite a bit of money. They had no concept of the value of real estate, especially land that was soon to support an oil pipeline. Well, most of them didn't. Jim Hatcher had never laughed quite as loudly as the others, and had never quite kissed my hindquarters the way most of the individuals in the group had come to do. They had no idea what I was about to do, but Jim suspected. He could smell the rodentia that hid beneath my assurances. Rotten bastard. Still, he played along, just giving me sidelong suspicious glances that he thought I wouldn't notice, and occasionally glaring daggers in my periphery. Now there he was, striding purposely up the trail towards the stand I'd borrowed. He wore a determined expression, and I shifted my borrowed rifle nervously where it rested along my knee. Before he arrived, I assured myself that there was a round in the chamber. Sure enough, he was there to issue a challenge, by way of peppering me with questions that it was not in my best interest to answer. At least not honestly. Still, who do you think he was? If he didn't want to deal, he could back out and I'd work with the rest of the group. It was odd having such a heated discussion at such a low volume. The very nice deer stand was well insulated, and we didn't disturb the local wildlife as much as their hunger did. Presently, a few deer walked boldly out to the feeder, in plain view and within the killing radius of our firearms. I pointed them out to Jim, and he allowed himself to become distracted. I offered him the shot, which brought him back to his suspicious state. I thought you wanted to prove yourself. You can't convince me on this deal, but some of the others will look on you more favorably if you take down that big buck. I obliged and brought down the one with the largest rack. It leapt and ran a short distance, but hadn't quite made it back to the trees before it collapsed. As we approached the steaming animal, it lay, still moving and twitching, still suffering. I drew my knife, and Jim quickly held out his hand to stop me from approaching the dying creature. You can't get close. The antlers are obviously pointy, but so are those hooves. If you don't have a pistol to finish it, you can use mine." He patted at the holstered handgun that hung on his heavy belt. I smiled and said, "Thank you, Jim. I know you don't like or trust me. That means a lot." The knife slid into his throat quite easily. It wasn't a regular hunting knife, but the stiletto I carried, a carbon spike that would get a pass at metal detectors. It wasn't hard to shift his falling body onto that of the buck. A little handiwork, and the puncture had clearly been made by an antler. Oh, I couldn't reach him in time. The creature lay there so still it completely fooled us. Oh, what a tragedy! I made a bundle off those yokels. They were too freaked out to question me. Didn't want to think about their poor dead friend and the incident that cut his life short. The pain receded, and I adjusted back to my true memories. I had stepped up closely to the dying buck, and Jim had stepped up to stop me. He slipped just as the deer twitched. It was completely an accident. I was sure I remembered, yet not for long. The splitting agony once more engulfed my poor head, and the hooves bounded, and the weight flattened my chest, my lungs, my head, my poor mind. Late last week, I developed one of the intense headaches that had plagued me since my late teens. No doctor, no medicine could overcome them. No amount of medication or yoga or natural solutions would assuage the roar and thunder. They simply had to pass. They did not come often, or I would have jumped from something high with a hard surface below. Yet when they arrived, they blinded me to all else and were inevitably accompanied by a tremendous rage. I knew it was coming. I hadn't had that many, but I knew it would arrive soon. It had been a while, and yet that vague notion of impending doom and misery, the melancholy and distraction that absorbed my waking thoughts, and the nightmares that plagued my subconscious by night. Just as well I slept, when the pain arrived, I would not rest until it subsided. It slammed into me, and all the memories returned. The real memories, the ones I'd had in my fever-induced, nightmare-ridden coma, with the crushing weight on my chest, robbing me of breath and vitality. The ones that revealed the monster I was. Then my subconscious seized the reins of my body, and I waited the fury that was to come. I'd been in trouble for some time. My fortunes had faded, but I'd found ways to regain some prosperity. Some people called it a pyramid scheme, a fraud. I hadn't held a gun, I hadn't robbed anyone, or broken into their homes, or sold drugs to their kids. I'd simply shown them the possibility that we could all make some money. Most of us had, at least for a while. There was a primary pair of complaints, a couple who had caught on early in the process, not as stupid as most of the rest. This time I took a direct approach. I waited for garbage pickup day. When one came out to drop the trash out over the edge of the dumpster, I stepped out from behind it and winged him with the bat. He fell immediately, and after a few more homers to the noodle, he was limp. His body was ridiculously heavy, but once I'd tipped the top portion into the dumpster, the rest was easier. I'd taken his wallet and keys, had to make sure it looked good. It had almost taken too long. The missus arrived just as expected to see what was keeping her precious hubby from breakfast. She was easier to lift. I tossed the wallet and both sets of keys into a storm drain several blocks away. There wouldn't be security video. No one filmed dumpsters. And I'd worn gloves and a hoodie, so no DNA. The blood might show, but it was cloudy, and the rain was in the forecast. Then that fever. Maybe something I caught from hanging around the dumpster. I crashed back into my emaciated ruin of a body and expected the low-level misery to continue. Yet I noticed that all the pains had faded, except for the raw discomfort in my throat and a heavy pain in my chest as the ventilator pumped the organs and oxygen flowed through the tubes in my nostrils. This was terribly uncomfortable, but not the sheer desolation of discomfort and nagging pains I'd felt for so long. I was able to work through some cognate thoughts. Why had all of these flashback dreams that ended so differently from my reality? Was it all just delirium brought about by fever and illness? Surely I'd not committed so many heinous atrocities. I couldn't be the monster I'd imagined myself to be. I felt a bit of euphoria as the last of my discomforts faded. A beeping noise had impinged on my hearing, but now it had become a steady drone. We've all been very appreciative that you've stayed so often at your ex-brother-in-law's side. Not many in-laws would do that during an active marriage. You've been a true blessing for the man's last few weeks. Dr. Granger gave Debbie Sturleson, Diane's sister, a sad but sincere smile. Oh, I'd have done anything for my baby sister's husband. Debbie returned the sad but sincere smile, even place a curse on him, and watch the nightmare ride him to death, she thought with an inward smile. That was not sad, but satisfied, though still quite sincere. So quoth this raven. A big thank you to Bear for sharing his stories with me. I know I've been hitting the camping stories hard. I'm still quite far behind. I'd like to catch up a little bit. But there's still so much to do. We still have the Winter Kingdom to catch up on and all sorts of things. So I'll just keep plugging along. If you have any particular requests, some you'd like more than others, let me know in the comments. And a lot of you aren't subscribed. If you would do that, I would be ever so grateful. And, give me a like. That's always helpful. Thank you, my darlings. Thank you so kindly for stopping by my chateau, my darlings. It does mean so much to me. Please, if you have not subscribed, as many of you have not, please do so. Give me a like so I know what you would like to hear. And comment. I always love to read your comments. And special thanks to my Patreon and membership supporters. Ciao, darlings.